Right, hello everyone. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction. Welcome to one of our breakout sessions called Climate Change, Liberal Solutions. My name's Luke. Today's panel is going to be chaired by Matthew Yglesias. Matt is a Bloomberg opinion columnist and he writes the slow, boring newsletter. If, like me, you're on Substack at all, everyone should know Matt's newsletter and go ahead and read it. So he's going to be moderating today's panel. We also have three very distinguished guests to talk with us today. I'm going to read off a phone because there are very many credentials to get through with this lineup. We've got Jonathan Adler. He's a professor of law and the director of the Coleman P. Burke Center for Environmental Law at Case Western Reserve University of Law. His books include Climate Liberalism, Marijuana Federalism, and Business and the Roberts Court. We've also got Nils Gilman. He's the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President at the Berggruen Institute, in which capacity he directs the day-to-day activities of the Institute, leads its research program, and serves as deputy editor of Noema magazine. Finally, we've got Joseph Majkut. He's Director of Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before that, he worked as Director of Climate Policy at the Niskanen Center, where he led that group's efforts to research and promote carbon pricing, low carbon innovation, regulatory reform, and other market reforms to speed up decarbonization. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Matt. We're going to have an hour and a half in this session. There'll be time for audience Q&A at the end. So I'll see you all at 3:30 and maybe we can carry on the discussion then. Over to you, Matt.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me on this panel. Thanks to everyone who's come here. You know, I feel like we should have been given the bigger room to talk about this because one of my hot takes is that the climate issue, I think, is actually central to the kind of global crisis of liberalism, more central than a lot of people realize because there isn't as much debate about it inside kind of intellectual thinky circles as there is about some other topics. But I think that the push to address climate change both drives left-wing people towards certain very illiberal approaches, both substantively and procedurally, and then backlash to global efforts to address climate change is really fuel for a lot of right-wing populist backlash type material. I think that in America, you know, sort of climate movement people used to look across the Atlantic very wistfully and say, oh, why can't we just have like this great bipartisan consensus like they have over there? But you're starting to see that where you have a bipartisan consensus, you just get a backlash from people who are kind of outside the system. And, you know, far right has, you know, definitely gained steam off of immigration, but also off of climate backlash stuff. And in a way, the liberal answer to climate backlash is less obvious. I think that on some level, you know, liberal politicians are comfortable saying, okay, you know, people got mad about the border, so we got to send some more agents down there. Climate is tough. You know, people will, a large, well-funded movement that has a lot of purchase in the media, that has a lot of activist clout, will tell you, like, you are dooming society to extinction if you don't do exactly what we want, which creates kind of limits to political flexibility, creates a lot of problems. So I think we want to talk here about both the dilemma there and also possible solutions. I think we're going to go first to Nils. Think about, you know, apocalypticism and liberalism and how it works together.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And thank you, everybody, for coming here today to talk about this. I totally agree with you, obviously, Matt. That's why I'm on this panel, that this topic is, I think, a really critical one, not just for the substance of how do we address climate change, but also for thinking about, you know, how do we do that while preserving liberalism in a variety of different ways. And let me just start with one point. You know, Mark Lila this morning was talking about the historical dramaturgy that is driving people on the right. There's also a historical dramaturgy which is driving people on the left regarding climate change. Exactly what Matt was just saying, which is that, you know, we have, you know, to quote Greta Thunberg, we only have 11 years, or maybe it's 13, or maybe it's 9, but it's not very long. And you know, if we don't do that, the sky almost quite literally will fall on us. And
6 now.
Oh, is it only 6 now? Okay, great. I'm glad we've been spending our time well. So there's a lot of evidence in the political science literature that predictions of extremism don't drive people towards solutions that are really about give and take. And one of the things I've been a little bit frustrated by in this whole last 24 hours is that I think what exactly we mean by liberalism is kind of a shifting and moving target, and none of us pin this down. But one of the hallmarks of liberalism is the idea of turn taking in policymaking, the idea that there's a legitimate opposition, that you will switch sides, and you'll each get a bite at the apple every 4 years or 6 years or 8 years, depending on how it goes, and that you should expect that the other side will get a turn. If you drive towards apocalyptic rhetoric about any particular topic, and there's a ton of that associated with climate change on the left in particular, it says that this topic should be taken off the table of politics. And this absolutely should be, there's one solution and we only have one way of doing this. And the thing I worry about is not just that that's illiberal in itself, but that it drives the backlash that Matt was just talking about. And I actually think if we think about the kind of extremist demands with respect to climate change, and I'm talking here for a moment about people who aren't denying that climate change is happening, I'm not sure that the left has a more plausible story to tell than the right. And let me just be specific about that. It's actually tied up with the issue of immigration, which is, one of the ways to think about what's driving climate change is overconsumption. And the number one thing that drives increasing consumption is people getting richer. And the fastest way for somebody to get rich is not to get rich by staying in the global south, but it's to move from the global south to the global north. And so the migration issue is deeply tied up, particularly on the right, with the non-climate change denying right, with the issue of immigration. I mean, people don't remember this, but the number one anti-immigration organization in the United States throughout the Cold War and into the 1990s was the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club said, look, if we bring more people to America, there's going to be more consumption, there's going to be more use of natural resources here, and this is just going to be bad. And they weren't really focused on climate change at that point. They were focused on environmental preservation and conservation in general, but the point still holds. Now, there was a purge that took place in the 1990s, and they dropped that kind of politics. But if you ask yourself a question, what's more realistic? The proposals that are being put on the table by the left regarding climate change. So we should have some sort of a global government that's going to dictate, from the top down exactly how, everything from our carbon emission standards to consumption standards, make everybody put on the hair shirt all over the planet, figure out what we're going to do in terms of equity with development in the global south. Is that a more realistic thing, or is it more realistic just to shoot people at the border? And I mean realistic by practical. It's actually, the latter is a much, much more practical thing. So if you buy that we only have 6 years now, and you buy, as people on the right do, that immigration is a major problem, and it's also a problem because of the way in which it stokes consumption that drives climate change, you're pushing people towards a politics, if you want to be realistic about doing something within the next 6 years, which is deeply illiberal. So the first thing I would say is I think that the catastrophism around climate change is a really bad idea because it drives people towards illiberal politics of all sorts of different kinds. The second thing I would say is that we don't just have 6 years, and it's absurd to think that we do. This is a long-term problem. It's been literally hundreds of years in the making in terms of building a carbon-based civilization all over the world. And it's going to take us probably almost as long to unwind that. And we're going to have to live with the consequences of the fact we put a ton of carbon, gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. That's just something we're going to have to deal with. And acting like this is a policy solution that has to happen overnight and that there's going to be no give and take on this politically is deeply illiberal. And the more one says that, the more one pushes away from liberalism as a general set of principles.
Yeah. But Jonathan, though, you're the expert in this. Like, there is a liberal way to think about climate change, right? And
yeah, I mean, no, so there certainly is, and a lot of folks who take at least the libertarian manifestations of liberal policy positions in a lot of other contexts abandon it in the context of climate change, which is a problem. If we step back and just think about environmental protection generally as something that we ask government to do, or kind of what the liberal case for environmental protection is, it begins with the government protecting people and their property from harms caused by the misuse of other people's property, right? I do something on my property that causes harm to you, to your stuff. You can go back, one of my favorite old cases is William Aldridge's case from, I think it's 1623. And it's a guy has a pig farm And his neighbor's like, the pigs stink. And I can't sit at my table and have dinner because of the odors. And you read this opinion in the parts that are not in Latin, because it sound like something that like some law and economics person would have written in the 1970s, because the farm owners are like, well, I'm producing valuable stuff for society. I am helping people be fed. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have pork on your dinner plate. From a welfare maximizing standpoint, I have to be allowed to do this, and your nose shouldn't be so sensitive. The court says, no, that's not how it works. Right? You have the right to do the things on your property. He has the right to do things on his. But when you start to intrude, it's the pollution version of the aphorism about my right to swing my hand ends at the tip of your nose. It's the same principle. And historically, that's the way a lot of, that was the beginnings of environmental policy before we had big federal regulatory agencies. Over time, we realized that it's often not this bilateral problem, right? It's not one farmer and one homeowner. It's lots of people, lots of activities, the accumulation of many activities in a particular area so that the concentration of effects reaches a point where it actually becomes a problem or it's not de minimis. And again, the same principles would underlie both the early zoning sorts of laws that were designed to deal with this, right? How do we prevent these sorts of conflicts ex ante rather than ex post? The progressive era smoke control movement, very much designed to make sure, okay, you can burn coal, but you can't burn it in a place that's going to make people nearby sick. And that resulted in initially moving a lot of these facilities outside of the cities. At a certain point, the politics of environmental issues as the problems become more complicated, as the stakes become larger, make these coordination problems look more difficult. And they've produced this illiberal response of not merely saying, not just in terms of the policy measures, but the reaction of being, well, the problem can't be real, right? The need to deny the problem so as to deny the rationale for government intervention, or to suggest that, well, if it's a catastrophe, if we can disprove it's a catastrophe, well, then we don't have to worry about anything at all. That it's this binary choice, right? If it's a catastrophe, yes, we have to do terrible things, but if it's not, we can ignore it. But of course, that's not the traditional, very liberal way of thinking about these sorts of problems. Back when I worked, or years ago, I worked at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which I guess is still today the leading don't take action on climate change organization here in DC. A few years after I left and I went to academia, I wrote a paper saying, look, if we take these ideas about property rights, about protecting property rights, not merely from the government, but from others seriously, you don't have to be catastrophic to think that climate change is a problem within this traditional classical liberal framework, right? You can take very modest, non-apocalyptic scenarios about things like sea level rise. And you can point out that just as there are old cases about pig farmers, there are old cases about land modifications that cause the flooding of neighbors' property. And it was recognized, you do something on your property that causes standing water on your neighbor's property, that's a trespass, that's a property rights violation. We can have a discussion about when it's not one landowner versus another landowner, it's millions of people emitting stuff and millions of people's land being affected very far away, about what sort of institutional mechanisms we want to have to deal with that. But you don't actually need to prove very much. You don't need to prove we only have 6 years to show that that's a problem. Similarly, if we just think about it as a risk problem, right? Is it all that different from national defense? Right? We don't invest in national defense because we know with certainty that Russia, China, pick the country you want, is going to do X by a particular date certain. We know that the risk of them doing something sufficiently bad is such that prudent investments that can reduce the likelihood or the consequences of those actions worthwhile. You think of it kind of like an insurance problem. Similarly, that's a very traditional way of thinking about large-scale environmental problems like climate. We'll get into, I think, about, okay, what do we do about it, and whether or not, and I think that Joe's going to take the first part of that. But I think in terms of thinking about the problem, it is very useful to not think about climate change as just this kind of separate category. It's apocalypse. That means all the rules are thrown out the window, but are rather just a more complicated, more difficult version of the sort of problem that we've been thinking about dealing with liberal institutions and liberal ideas about the role of government for a very long time. And part of the problem is that we've forgotten a lot of that, and we don't talk about climate change in those kinds of terms.
Yeah. So to that point, Joe, like what, so it's, I think in the liberal framework, right? I talk to economists. I used to not cover climate because I felt like the answer was actually really clear and well known, which is like there is some negative externality associated with these emissions. We should price the externality. People might disagree as to exactly what the price should be, but that's the democratic politics. The answer isn't 0 and it's not 1 million. That is not what is happening. And so how does like policy making address the fact that we're not landing on that kind of liberal solution?
I think you're totally right. And I agree. And that this liberal solution kind of comes out of a textbook and it feels quite simple. It feels quite simple, right? And you can let the democratic process figure out the price. But here's a couple challenges. One is the way that the problem as climate change has been framed is that the goal is to avert dangerous climate change. And maybe it was an error, but one of the things that happened was they asked scientists to figure out what dangerous climate change meant. And that kind of led to the imposition of certain temperature targets associated with climate safety, climate danger, and climate apocalypse. That's all highly uncertain, right? Like we don't really know whether 2 degrees centigrade of warming, one, exactly what it means, and two, whether that is the tipping point that things become a real problem. But they're, rather than treated as rough guidelines, they're treated as barriers in the policy discourse, so to say. And that imposes 2 challenges for the textbook liberal solution. The first is you have no idea what price will give you emissions reductions consistent with that temperature target. And the second is you need to establish that price not in a world where there's a unitary rational decision maker, like where the economist Bill Nordhaus gets to say the appropriate price to reach that target or to capture this externality is $65 a ton of CO2 emissions and everybody go do it. You have wildly disparate decision makers across a bunch of different countries engaging in a sort of a collective action problem. And so the path to a sort of global harmonized carbon price is looking very, very, very long I think principally for those 2 reasons. Then there's a whole bunch of secondary reasons, which are, how much are democratic institutions willing to impose costs on people today for benefits that are realized in the future. And how much of a disruption, because I think if you're honest about the scale of both the problem and of a transition to a near zero carbon emissions economy, the disruption in economic activity, the metabolism of the economy is quite large. And that raises a third issue, which we've a little bit touched on, which is kind of like relative value judgment, right? One of the critiques of global climate action is that it prevents human flourishing, particularly in the global south, where energy is still quite spare, people live desperate lives, and there's a real concern that if you move too quickly on climate, you prevent people from using fossil fuels as we use them today, then you have, you're sort of like preferencing people who don't exist far off in the future over like desperate people today. And I think those 3 challenges are sort of why we don't have this textbook example. Where we are underdeveloped is we haven't really thought through and have only like practically started thinking through recently, like how do you get closer to that world from where we are today? What are the ways that liberal insights about using markets, about individual choice, about price signals can be leveraged to approach decarbonization and not solve for 2050 today, but like push us in the right direction right now?
So can I ask you, I'm reminded, I guess, that ISMA, our hosts and organizers here must have, I think, their personal origins on the political right. And that's how you wind up with a mantle and stuff like that progressives wouldn't do. And so why is it, Jonathan, that this kind of like property rights viewpoint that you have seems to have so little purchase on on the political right? Like, what explains in your experience? Yeah, I mean, you worked at CEI, right? Why isn't there some like, okay, let's do a little bit? Because I think Joseph is explaining like why conservative-minded people don't want to do what like the science allegedly tells them, but like, why is the alternative nothing?
Well, so I'll tell you, when I worked at CEI, and I began there in 1991, there was this great quote from former Senator Tim Wirth that was always kind of fun to deploy about climate change. This is in the 90s. And I'm paraphrasing, but it was basically, we've got to ride this issue because even if it's not really a problem, we'll still be doing the right things, right? So there's this idea that's very pervasive, that's not wholly unfounded, that climate change creates an excuse to give government control over lots of things, energy in particular, and that if your view of government is that that's threatening, that's scary, it's something that's ultimately very illiberal, right? In the sense that it's hostile to innovation, it's hostile to market dynamism. That's a really scary, scary thing. And it's okay to be defending property rights if you're talking about defending the property owner from the farm next door, because that's just a little localized problem. But if you're talking about energy use throughout the global economy, oh my gosh, that's really scary. And I think part of what feeds that is the only way we want to talk about climate policy is how do we hit that target that Joe mentioned? How do we know that the policy we've adopted will hit that target? So even on the left and with the environmental community, there is a preference for regulation over pricing because regulation at least gives you the illusion that you have a target that will be met by a particular day. I say illusion because it turns out environmental law does not work that way. It has never worked that way. We don't meet targets. I did a paper for Joe at Niskanen that actually points out that we pretend as if you say we should have regulations and you snap your fingers and suddenly they're in place and they're complied with and their targets are met. And that's just not the world we live in. The throughput capacity for environmental regulations is kind of like the throughput capacity for environmental impact statements. Like the government can't do the volume that we need if that's the way we're going to decarbonize.
I send that paper to somebody at least once a month.
Well, I appreciate that. I should get royalties. Yeah. But the big point is that there's this fear, right? Which am I afraid more of, climate change or climate change policy? And there's certainly for folks that if climate change policy means the government is going to decide how much energy each and of what sort each industry gets to use and in what time frame and what car you drive and what kind of stove you have and what kind of house you live in and so on, well, then climate change has got to be really, really, really bad to justify that. And I would argue that not only is that not the choice we face, that in fact, going down the road is actually not even the best way to deal with climate change. But I think that's what feeds the right side of the political spectrum's fear of climate policy.
And Nils, and to some people on the left, right, it's like that prospect is thrilling.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so some of you probably know in Germany, the Green Party, when it emerged in the 1970s, was known as the Watermelon Party because it was a bunch of former communists and they were green on the outside but red on the inside. And I have a coinage that I've tried to promote with limited success that there's also a version of that on the right, which is avocado politics, green on the outside and brown on the inside, right? So because you can't get from is to ought, and what exactly the policy is, even if you acknowledge that you have this problem, is not obvious. One of the things we've been talking about on this panel is we've been basically talking about climate change mitigation issues. But there's another dimension of liberalism that I just want to bring up, which is on the adaptation side. And here I think there are more opportunities for doing things that are liberal. And I'm going to plug with the book I just published, which has a chapter where we talk about a lot more local solution, especially on the adaptation side, and possibilities for me and my co-author call translocal collaborations around climate change adaptation strategies. So for example, I agree, I probably am more sympathetic to government regulation than you are, but I'm not as ideologically scared of it, but I also agree that it can get very heavy-handed in ways that are not productive. But one of the things that's definitely true is that in terms of the actual impacts that are being faced in climate change, you look at a country the size of the United States, especially, it's radically different. I mean, the climate change adaptation challenges that a city like Miami is facing are totally different from the ones that a city like Los Angeles are facing. But the kind of challenges Los Angeles is facing are very similar to the ones that Cape Town is facing, Perth is facing, Lisbon is facing. These are all, cities in the southwest corners of continents that have desiccating Mediterranean climates where it's fire, it's drought, it's heat waves, right? Those are the challenges. And so there's all sorts of opportunities, I think, for transnational collaboration. And some of these networks are in fact already emerging, the C40 network, the Fearless Cities network, that are actually fomenting that kind of exchange of expertise, sometimes resources, sometimes technology. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for things that are perfectly amenable anyways with liberal solutions at the level of adaptation.
Something that both these guys said reminded me that, this sort of the green, the watermelons, right? Green on the outside, red on the inside. And some of the reluctance to embrace this property framework is that like all this is in like strong economic activity, right? Like liberals like growth.
Yeah.
Last year, the world had about 2% GDP growth overall. Greenhouse gas emissions last year went up about 2%, right? So like there is a way in which if you take solving this problem seriously, you need to envision a fairly different pathway for economic growth. And I think that explains a lot of what liberals are thinking about. Because if you take that property rights thing seriously, I don't get to do anything, right? I can't drive, I can't use electricity because I'm worried about, damage to somebody's property a long time away. The end state is quite severe.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps. There are ways of thinking about the collective action problem where we think about reciprocity of advantage and the like, where we're all allowed to engage in equivalent types of conduct, and we engage in some sort of collective enterprise to make sure it's not too excessive. On this issue of adaptation that was just brought up, though, I've been pointing this out to people now, I think for close to 20 years, that the UN IPCC on issues like water rights is more liberal and more market-oriented than pretty much any major environmental NGO in this town, and certainly than the U.S. government's policy. Because for 20 years, the UN IPCC has noted that on the issue of water availability and access to water, which is a huge issue and something that climate change is going to affect in a lot of unpredictable ways, but significant ways. The UN said, look, you're not going to be able to build your way out of that with infrastructure, especially in the global south, but not only in the global south. You're going to have ways of pricing and reallocating water in response to demands. And we know how to do that. We've shown how to do that. Water markets are, very robust where they're allowed to operate. And crickets, right? Policymakers, especially in the United States, don't want to talk about that. And there is this, it feeds into the idea that it's a watermelon thing, because here's an example where that we know, we have clear empirical evidence, we know how to deal with, how do you deal with dramatic changes in the availability and supply and timing of water. And we know what sorts of institutions can handle that sort of thing. And yet we don't want to talk about that. Instead, we want to tell you what shower head you use.
I kind of want to slice open the watermelon. I don't know. Mix this metaphor. If you read the Communist Manifesto, there's a bunch of stuff in there that's like, there should be public schools, or like the government should regulate the provision of credit. That like today would be considered totally non-radical and commonsensical. Now, if you read that in the 1840s, you could be like, these guys are fucking communists. Because like literally they are, right? And they were. But part of the way we have functional politics is that people on the left, I think over history, have put a lot of issues on the table, have sometimes had plausible solutions, have sometimes not had plausible solutions, have often said the only way to solve this problem is to completely remake society. And movements of the right have tried to accommodate these concerns, right? So all around the world, we have public sector pension programs for the elderly. And even like in Singapore, where it's a mandated savings, like there's no place that is a pure market solution to that kind of problem. But that's involved people from a market liberal tradition saying, you know what, I'm not going to just be like, secretly these guys are communists, whether or not they're secretly communists. It's like, I'm going to take responsibility and try to do something. And I think, at Niskanen, when you were there, right, that was like part of the original vision there. And it seems like we've gotten like no traction with that.
More than you would think, but we kind of came in at a low point when I started at Niskanen. That was 2015. And if you asked a Republican member of Congress what they thought about climate change, they would say either it's a hoax or I'm not a scientist. Like, don't ask me. Like, I don't want to deal with that. And the Obama administration at the time was pursuing a very significant regulatory agenda, and it had become highly politicized after an attempt to pass a cap and trade bill a few years before. So there was a little bit of just like partisan positioning.
Yeah.
But that is one of the key areas where just a rampant anti-intellectualism and a rejection of the problem infected the right. When in COVID, when a bunch of people started embracing weird conspiracy theories or just said like, screw it, we're going to just lose a bunch of people and that's worth it. That was no surprise to those of us who'd been trying to pay attention to climate issues. It's a similar phenomenon.
Can I just weigh in briefly on that point? I mean, another way in which one can think about the relationship between climate change, or for that matter, pandemic risk and mitigation management issues and liberalism is there is a deep linkage, and there's a long intellectual history of this between, I want to be very precise here, the scientific method and liberalism. I think one of the things that was really catastrophic in terms of public messaging around the pandemic was say, trust the science, which often got transmitted into trust the scientists, which you definitely don't want to do necessarily because they're human and they're fallible. They're not necessarily going to be right about things. And science is always provisional. And one of the things that I think liberalism and science have in common is they're trying to be less wrong. And they're willing to revise their results, right? And one of the things that autocracies are notoriously bad at is revising results based on evidence or suppressing evidence, believing their own press releases and so on. I think there is a deep linkage between the scientific method, right, as a mode of inquiry into empirical reality and the democratic method as a mode of inquiry into popular opinion. It's subject to constant revision. So that's another way in which I think we can try to celebrate a connection between these things.
And it seems to me that scientists working in this space have been either ineffective or unwilling to articulate the gap, honestly, between like, what does the IPCC report say? And like, what do the environmental NGOs say that they say? It's been really striking to me as somebody who didn't cover climate much and then waded into it, that like the people who talk the most about trusting the science says, this, that, and the other thing, they're not characterizing it correctly.
Well, and there's a lot of pressure to maintain what is ultimately a simple narrative. And there's a belief, and it's a well-intentioned belief that the nuts and bolts of climate change are complicated. It's not immediate. It's a long-term problem, but it's still very important. And the way you get in a democratic society people to act is simplifying it and scaring people. And so the folks that want to attribute every hurricane or whatever to climate change aren't, they're not trying to this isn't a stalking horse for some broad illiberal agenda. It's, we're oversimplifying some, but this is the sort of thing we are worried about over the long term, and we don't think the democratic process will be able to handle the complexity. That what's really going on is we're increasing the upward potential of hurricane damage and hurricane storms and the likelihood over a longer period of time. But we can't say it about a particular storm. And if you try and say that on the evening news, people are going to change the channel or they're going to fall asleep. And where you say, oh my God, Beryl or whatever is the result of climate change, maybe that gets politics in action. The problem, of course, is that when someone goes and looks at the science and they pull out the IPCC and they talk about, okay, what are the different levels of attribution we can engage in with regard to different types of changes in weather. And they see the IPCC is saying hurricanes, we can't really tie that knot yet. Well, it's like we saw with COVID. It's like, well, now they've exaggerated. Right? Climate change is still a problem, but the specific thing they led with wasn't true. So maybe that's an excuse. That gives me permission now to say they're lying about everything. And in a democratic polity, I think it's on the same sort of thing, right? It's undermined the ability of science to inform the policy process because the way science of climate is presented and is, oversimplifies and glosses over a lot of complexity, and in some cases just says stuff that isn't quite true.
I think I think there's like kind of three issues that need to be. I'm going to Rick Perry myself and forget one, but the first is for much of the last 2 decades where this was a big issue for public policy, we were so far behind the like envelope of uncertainty for is climate policy kind of working that I think that a lot of scientists or analysts in the field were kind of like, I don't need to debate whether we're going 50 or 60 miles an hour. We're going 5. Right. So until we're going 50, like that's not really worth talking about. I think that was a real dynamic. Secondly, scientists not always known as great communicators, and at least in the United States, have a very strong progressive inclination. Right? They're just like open-minded people. They exist in university communities. They're like, so there's a political mapping that does affect how they talk about stuff. It's self-reinforcing socially. And then the third is like what kind of scientist you're talking to also matters. Sure. So I once asked my advisor, I was a science graduate student, like, why is Jim Hansen so worried about climate change? Right? Very famous, prominent climate scientist. And he showed me a couple charts. And one of them showed like, if you look at the glacial and interglacial cycles, right? So the difference between the planet when you're in an ice age and when you're in a condition that looks roughly like today, or in these kind of like hothouse worlds, the difference in radiative forcing or in CO2 levels in the atmosphere is not as large as the one that we're provoking. Mm-hmm. The just changes happen over a really long time, but they're like a qualitatively different planet. So oftentimes in the science community, you have people who are thinking about these planetary changes that are like occurring on vastly larger scales than anybody is like prepared to think about unless you work in that field. And that's that they take that to heart and don't again communicate it well. Whereas meteorologists are like 2 degrees. That's 5 minutes, man. Like, who cares?
Right. It was 10 degrees warmer yesterday, right?
Nils, you're fine.
I want to ask you about I think these last 2 responses have both touched on the long-term nature of the harms. And it seems to me this is a kind of classic critique of democracy, right? Is that democracy cannot engage in long-term thinking. I remember I went on just like a Chinese government propaganda tour. And, like the thing they drilled in all the time about like, we're going to crush the West is because we have this long range plan for greatness and your people are looking to the next election in November. And I mean, I think that's an argument that, transcends climate, right? That these Chinese guys were not talking about climate. And has kind of, it's a classic authoritarian criticism of democracy that we can't handle these kind of long-term issues.
So I have several responses to that. I spent a lot of time in China for my sins, and I talk a lot about climate issues when I'm there. So first of all, I think just as a matter of sort of historical fact, the evidence that autocracies are better at thinking, much less acting long-term, is scant on the ground. I mean, these guys are often very worried about whether they're going to get overthrown by the next junta, and so they're very worried about short-term things. Right. You look at the environmental impact of the major autocracies of the 20th century; it's horrific. I mean, people can talk about it, the Nazis' forestry policy, but like the actual thing that happened between 1939 and 1945 was not good for the European environment, let alone for the human beings who lived there, right? Let's not talk about the Soviet Union, and anybody who was in China over the last 20 years has experienced the unbelievable environmental degradation that's gone on there. So I think that, we could go into smaller countries that have similar stories. So the evidence that there's actually better long-term thinking from autocracies than democracies, I think is just not true. I mean, it's propaganda that these guys promote. The second thing I would say, though, is that one thing that the Chinese regime in particular has been extremely good at is scaling up technology production, particularly around green technology, right? I mean, they completely dominate the solar cell market right now. They are going to dominate the shit out of the EV market in the next 10 years unless radical measures are taken. And, this is a major strategic problem for the United States, among other things. I personally have, 15 years ago when I first started getting into this, I worked a lot with 3-letter agencies here in this town. And, I've since become much more leery of the process of securitizing the climate change debate because I think it leads to bad outcomes of the sort I described in my first comment. And also just gets used by many agencies to justify their budgets for other reasons anyhow. But I do think that there is this quality to technology that I do think that the Chinese government in particular is good at, and probably better than us. Technology planning, I think that they have proven over the last 15, 20 years to be better than us at that. Although I don't know that that has anything to do with democracy per se. We used to be better at technology planning back in the 1950s and 60s.
You're making faces.
I'm skeptical of that. So I was going on two things. I mean, yes, it's true that, we are not good at, building, some grand cathedral that takes 150 years to build. But we do a lot of other things much, much better. And that's certainly good. I'll say two things. One, China's going to be able to build lots of stuff if they want to do it. The evidence that we have so far, and there's some research that Andy Morris and some other folks have that's coming out soon, that actually when you look at it qualitatively as opposed to quantitatively, they obtain far more patents for clean energy products, but the patents they're obtaining are very low value patents. All the high value patents are still here. They're not in China. They're not in Europe. The problem we have here is that we make it too difficult to do stuff. Right. The discussion we've been having about permitting for transmission lines is a very salient example of a problem that is endemic, right? Of that we've made it too hard to do stuff. And part of what we've made it too hard to do are the kind of the natural things that make problems like climate easier to solve. So, the least talked about and yet most important environmental trend of the 21st century in countries like the United States is net dematerialization. Using less stuff, less physical material year over year. And go home and think about that, because the United States will use fewer molecules of physical stuff next year than this year. That's mind-blowing, right? That wasn't planned, that wasn't designed, that wasn't programmed, that wasn't scheduled. It was because stuff costs. We pay for stuff, we pay to get it, we pay to manipulate it, we pay to deploy it, we pay, usually, unless we can figure out a way to turn it into smoke, we pay to dispose of it. And in a world in which you can innovate, that over time leads to these trends. Right? We don't do that with energy because we don't fully integrate it into those market processes, those very liberal processes that encourage all of us collectively to try to make more with less tomorrow than we did today. And so if we want these bigger, longer term trends, we kind of know what the institutional framework needs to look like, right, to decarbonize. And we don't do that. China's not doing it either. Now, if we figure stuff out, China will build a ton of it. And I'm not sure that's bad. If they build a ton of it and it's less expensive for us, so then it's even easier for us to deploy it. The real challenge for an issue like climate change that's global is, are we able to be the engine of figuring out how to decarbonize? And we're kind of failing at that.
I would add one other thing. I mean, the other major factor, and I am in California where this problem is probably as bad as it is anywhere, is this permitting issue and also environmental impact statements. And this is something where I don't want to say it's too much democracy, but I would say it's the wrong kind of democracy. Community engagement around how to build things is something that's really important. I'm not here to denigrate that at all, but the particular way in which it's been institutionalized through the legal system in the United States, I think, is incredibly destructive to our ability to actually deploy stuff at scale.
And it's not clear it's democratic, right? Because the people that show up at the planning meeting to complain about the wind turbine that's going to go on the other side of the hill that they heard about and they're afraid they're going to see when they drive to work, are not necessarily representative of the people as a whole. And I should just note, the more you dig into it, we talk about NEPA and environmental impact statements, especially for energy infrastructure. State and local barriers are probably greater than federal barriers, but for everything but large transmission projects that have to go across federal land. I mean, and perhaps across tribal lands. Otherwise, the state and local barriers are greater, and we have things in federal law that magnify those state and local impacts. And I'll say, as someone that loves decentralizing political authority, that's a hard fact to wrestle with, right? Because I like letting different communities make different choices, but letting different communities make different choices means it's really hard to build linear infrastructure, and you can't electrify and decarbonize through electrification if you can't build linear infrastructure.
It seemed like you wanted to say something on the securitization of the climate issue.
Well, people come to me all the time because I work at a national
You have
security
strategic
think tank.
and international studies
And they're like,
in your job title.
Yeah, like, oh, do you think we could break the political problem if we just talking about national security? Like Republicans like national security, and then we'll get them on the climate, like get some third-rate retired generals to talk about how climate change is a threat multiplier.
Love generals.
No, it doesn't work.
I literally spent a big chunk of my career earlier trying to do exactly that, and I can promise you it does not work.
Yeah, I tried to get a bunch of Republicans to support carbon pricing. That didn't work either. It's okay. It's worth doing. I wanted to actually raise the issue of the Chinese EVs, because this is actually where I think like liberalism can confront the problem in a way that's going to be really important and have pragmatic impacts like now.
Okay.
And the reason for that is whether it's in electric vehicles, that's the place where we're doing the most, right? The Biden administration, climate champions, raised 100% tariff on the import of Chinese EVs, of which we import like near zero, right? They're like totally a specialty product, but you could imagine them coming to U.S. shores, maybe branded as U.S. vehicles, maybe in conjunction with GM or whomever, and it would bring a low cost, almost a new product category to the United States, which could favor decarbonization, give consumers lots of choice. And we're not looking like we want to do that because it would disrupt political balances here in the US related to auto manufacture. The unions don't like it. And this is a place where, liberals actually, I think, have a lot to say and would be an important part of the debate if they're, kind of like willing to engage with the actual issues that we face today.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great point. Do we have any questions in the audience and/or a microphone for questioners? Oh, okay, you got the mic. Yeah, let's go.
Thanks. Hi, thanks for this. My name is Mattia Ferraresi. I'm an editor with an Italian newspaper called Domani. I wanna go to the connection you did, Nils, between the link between scientific method and liberalism. I think is like very fascinating. I wonder if you can elaborate on that based on this observation that I have. That I think scientific method, and I think like the pandemic showed us this, that's my observation, has been mistaken or taken for what it was not. So in other words, I see a general tendency to ask to the scientific method some divine-like revelations in terms of on and off clear answer to your immediate need, as opposed to confronting from what it is, like a set of provisional and a constant dialogue in which you try to approximate the truth about something. I wonder, and so if that is true, which I think the pandemic showed us, that we wanted like this snap our fingers, we got the solution, we figure out the problem, instead of having like competing hypotheses on the table, which is, so I wonder if you think that based on this, also liberalism itself can sort of have the same perception problem, meaning we ask liberalism to be what, I don't know, in the Middle Age, you ask God to be in the same level of certainty, as opposed to having competing hypotheses and like half truth that in time may be sort of discussed and understood better and refined and rethought, that kind of thing.
Great question. Let me start with sort of maybe tangential observation. I think part of what we learned what became dramatized during the pandemic, but has also been true in the climate change debate, is that the logic, the discursive logic of scientific inquiry and political action are just totally different. Scientists, they have a hypothesis, they test it, they revise their hypothesis based on the data, revise, test, revise, test, revise. I mean, that's the model. And so everything, even gravity, right, is a theory, right? And it turns out that gravity has exceptions. There are waves in it, we now know. Newton declared it to be a law, but it has exceptions that were important to understand, right? The logic of politics, the discourse logic of politics, particularly executive decision making in politics is to be decisive, and to be decisive and claim that like you have good reasons to be decisive. You declare war or you don't declare war, and you can admit to some extent that you're doing it on the basis of imperfect information, but particularly in a democratic polity, actually, where you have to answer to voters, it's hard to admit that you're making a really tough decision on the basis of uncertain data, right? And we really saw that in the beginning of the pandemic. Like, should we have distancing? How far should the distancing be? Fauci said it should be 6 feet. I wasn't part of that debate. I don't know how they decided it should be 5 feet or 7 feet. I think they said 6 feet. That's about how tall a grown man is. So we're going to make it 6 feet, right? I bet it was that much logic.
Best example is in Europe, it was 2 meters, right? Because you're trying to have round numbers,
right?
You're not. Whereas in science, you have a point estimate that's the same,
right? Exactly. So I just think that there's a fundamental challenge between, as I say, the logic of politics and the logic of science. With that said, I do think that there can be alignments. I don't think liberalism has to be an absolutist faith. I think one of the things that liberalism can do as a political practice is to be open about the fact that it's a provisional process, right? And even, as I said earlier, the process of give and take between parties is partly an acknowledgement that nobody has a monopoly on truth, and the truth has to get revised in light of new information. One party rules for a while, they get to impose their policies, there's some unintended consequences, the other party points that out and they get a chance to try to fix them. That's actually, in some ways, sort of formally not that different from a scientist putting out a theory, somebody else testing the hypothesis and changing it again. So I think you can see that there are logics not between the politics of decision and the politics of, or the logic of science, but between the logic of liberalism and the logic of science.
That actually reminds me of a question is there anything optimistic to hope for out of a Republican administration in terms of the ping pong, not in terms of a Republican administration having a come to Jesus moment about the reality of climate change. We're not going to get a free trade Republican administration that would let the BYD cars in, right. But could we get substantial advances in nuclear technology, say, or some kind of permitting that would be useful? I mean, are there things we could try to look for, green shoots to try to encourage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's kind of like a few that I would point to. Nuclear is an obvious one, right? This is where, the sort of the oppositional forces that you were talking about earlier really could swing. Greens don't like nuclear for lots of historical reasons. Yeah. Republicans love them, sure. Love it. There's all sorts of authority within the federal government to help build nuclear here in the United States as well as abroad. And just an administration focused on that could make a lot of progress. Maybe there's some work that could be done on permitting, right? If you're concerned that an energy transition is going to require 4 times more lithium and a bunch of copper and all of that's probably true. Republicans might be better about permitting mines and development projects here in the U.S., especially on federal lands. Transmission might fit under the same
Trump
thing.
administration NEPA reforms would have made it a lot easier to build a lot of stuff. Those things that are subject to NEPA. The Biden administration rolled some of that back. The Supreme Court's actually going to hear a case on that. But on some of that sort of stuff, building stuff. Yeah. Now in a Republican administration, it'll probably build everything, right? So it's easier to build pipelines and transmission, but it would be easier to build transmission.
Man, I keep thinking about election result in November and a potential second Trump administration. Like, these Biden people are going to be so mad when all these Trump officials are standing in front of big green projects with a hard hat on, doing the ribbon cutting.
Yes. But also they have no one but themselves to blame. So I have a limited sympathy.
And then the last one is actually, I think, really critically important because U.S. is 10% of global emissions. There's no way you actually solve climate change without dealing with international emissions. And the Republican response to a lot of climate policy proposals historically has been like, what are you going to do about China and India? What are you doing about growing economies abroad? And I think Republicans actually would take that more seriously in an administrative sense, right? To ask for tougher deals on climate than I think a lot of people on the left do from India and China and others.
Go ahead.
I just add one other thing on that. My view for a long time has been that one of the mistakes that liberals have made with regard to climate policy is to try to do these big international gatherings where all 193 countries have to try to agree on some level, whether it's in Paris or Copenhagen or what have you. This is primarily it's a G2 problem. Like if DC and Beijing were able to get on board with, the US essentially representing the interests of the historical OECD countries and historical large emitters, and China representing, new emitters and developing countries. If DC and Beijing got together, the Europeans would certainly go along. That's right there, like almost 45% of global emissions, those three entities. And those are the three biggest trade partners for everybody else. So they could, if they really were serious about it, push almost everybody else. I mean, you wouldn't get Russia and Saudi Arabia maybe to come along, but, you never get total compliance with anything.
Two quick thoughts. One, in terms of being optimistic, there is work that Matt Burgess at the University of Colorado and some others have done looking at energy and climate policies at the state level and finding a degree of bipartisan cooperation at the state level that you don't see in DC. And so the question is the tribalism of Washington, DC going to seep down to the state level and prevent those things from proliferating, or are there lessons there we can learn that can be replicated here? And it's interesting empirical research. There's similar work by Mike Vandenberg at Vanderbilt has led a team looking at the degree of private sector emission reductions. And that does have effect around the world because you do have some companies that are more focused on supply chains and on making it possible to meet carbon targets within their supply chains and doing it without worrying about what the governments are telling them or not telling them to do. And insofar as their supply chains reach into other countries, that provides technology diffusion and the like. On the global agreement, I think the lesson we get from things like the Montreal Protocol and the like is when it's relatively cheap and easy to do, relatively cheap to have energy that's low carbon and to pay off or compensate the losers, we'll do it. But up until that point, international agreements and those confabs are a waste of money and politically probably harmful, right? Because we were talking in the beginning about kind of the illiberal opposition to climate policy. I mean, how do you stoke those fires? Oh, look, here are a bunch of people that flew, who, while telling us we have to use less energy, all got on airplanes and flew all the way around the world to go to some really fancy conference to hobnob and talk about how we're going to have to use less energy. And it's just both politically and practically, those conferences don't do much unless you're at the point where the folks that really care about action can write a check and are willing to write a check to get other folks to go along. And technologically, we're not there yet. But once we are, then it becomes easy.
All right, I derailed, but do we have any more questions here? Oh, we got so many. Okay, here.
Just further to the point about international emissions and looking at other regions that could be influenced by Washington or Beijing. I just returned from Southeast Asia. I've lived there for quite a bit of my life. I think if you include South Asia, it's a tough challenge to get Beijing to influence those countries, that region of the world. It's a tough challenge to get them to care and to prioritize climate change at all, or liberalism at all, because of economic development, right? It is just absolutely number one and number two and three, and all probably the top 10 priorities are all related to development. And then on down the list, yes, they do care about environmental impacts, but Vietnam, Indonesia, very different political systems, but they're just trying to industrialize. That's the top priority. What can we do to encourage those kinds of partners that we're trying to influence in political ways and environmental ways? What can we do to help them that is not these large confabs that I agree are not so useful?
I mean, this is where technological development is the American contribution, right? I mean, Indonesia is going to try to use low-cost technologies to industrialize, but what those technologies are is something that we can influence.
Right. And in the case of Indonesia, we've been working with them over the past few years to help close some of the dirtier coal plants, build out renewable or low carbon options. There's a bunch of American firms there trying to encourage carbon capture and storage as an example. I think there is a lot that we can do to help. You think about, like, we have the Department of Energy, right? And it is like the premier scientific and technical agency probably in the world. And oftentimes the energy ministry in a country like Indonesia is like small and doesn't have a lot of technical capacity, there's a lot we can do via diplomatic channels and then through trade policy export promotion and other things to help.
Isn't there also a lot we could be doing just in terms of the way we prioritize things? I mean, something like a low carbon way of making cement. Right. Yeah. Globally is going to do more for emissions than any utility emissions rule that the EPA spends, 15 years going back and forth with the courts over trying to adopt. Yet politically and governmentally, we spend all our time on the utility rule that's going to affect a declining share of emissions in the United States and will not result in exporting anything meaningful technology-wise, and ignoring the sorts of innovations that globally could actually matter.
Well, I don't spend my time on that stuff anymore because I read your paper.
No, but this is going to be really, I think, important for Democrats to think about as Republicans try to repeal Inflation Reduction Act energy spending provisions, right? Because that's a very heterogeneous bill. It has a lot of different provisions. And you can look at, if you're going to say, what are we going to fight to try to save? Some of those provisions are aimed at reducing short-term domestic emissions by speeding the pace at which Americans adopt certain well-established technologies. And some of those provisions are aimed at subsidizing the development of novel technologies, which, if they pay off, have a global payoff. And I think it's really important to try to get members of Congress to think about the global impacts rather than the line on the chart.
Right.
But we were talking before the panel, there's this kind of targetism that is dominating the NGO community rather than thinking about what's the specific real world impact of each measure on its own.
Yeah, I think that is actually that is changing over time, right? A lot of the climate movement, in my view, is sort of separating itself from the environmental movement. And a lot of climate people now do see the global public good associated with technology innovation as key to global decarbonization. And so there will be small groups of people saying, well, maybe we don't need to spend so much money deploying EVs in the United States, but man, these small modular reactors, those are going to be really good for global decarbonization. And then it's a matter of how is Congress going to set its priorities?
Yep. All right. Yep.
I'm still going back to the fundamental question, I think, here, which is liberalism the right philosophical framework for solving climate change? And I find myself still stuck on that because I agree with everything you guys have said. I generally share the approach and the perspective, and yet we haven't implemented a carbon tax, which would create the incentive structure, which would allow us a free and open society to go solve this problem in the correct way. Why have we not implemented a carbon tax? And I think we haven't implemented it because our values, it's hard for us to internalize the value of uncertain harms that will likely occur in the worst places in foreign countries. And it's just hard, I think, at least as I think about liberalism as, tangible personal free rights. It's just hard to get that around that scenario. And so I'm still stuck on that. I want to be able to tie liberalism to this problem in a tighter way.
Think more crassly about the politics. What I mean by that is that in the abstract, making energy more expensive and doing nothing else is a non-starter. And it's even more of a non-starter today than it would have been 8 years ago or 10 years ago. But there are things that can be traded for that, right? And from my perspective, I'm a former DC wonk who now lives in the Midwest, so maybe my perspective is wrong, but it's certainly that the willingness to have that kind of crass discussion about what are we willing to give up for a carbon tax is something that the environmental movement in particular has been really reluctant to have, because some of the things you would have to put on the table. One thing is, don't make it a spigot of money for the federal government. Do something where it's, like Jim Hanson's, but also, prior to West Virginia versus EPA, was there a deal where you're trading a carbon tax for the EPA's authority over stationary source emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, right? That's a deal that in a lot of parts of the country would have had some purchase, but there was no way to have that conversation. Well, that's no longer really much on the table now because EPA's authority over stationary sources is much less of a threat. So what's left? Well, tort liability, Now there's a cert petition pending with the Supreme Court, so that possible bargaining chip may go away too. So, I mean, there are lots of unpopular things that liberal governments have to do, and sometimes that's requires doing it in a way that recognizes the crass political deals that have to be made. Right? Margaret Thatcher paid off the unions to get rid of coal subsidies, and so I mean, and if you're not willing to do that, well, then you have to hope that the argument's going to win the day. And instead, we have carbon taxes. We have regulations that are slower, costlier, less dynamic, threaten innovation, and actually don't reduce emissions more quickly. That's the paper joke.
The other thing is, I think some people working on climate policy overread actually a point about like the fiscal situation and macroeconomics. That, I mean, it was probably 18 years ago, I remember being around the corner from here, and I saw, a young senator named Barack Obama talking at the debut of the Hamilton Project. And what his talk was very brief, but it was all about the imminent fiscal crisis that the United States of America was facing thanks to Bush's tax cuts and his irresponsible wars. And then he departed the stage, and Wonksaul came up, and that was what center-left Democrats thought the problem they were going to be dealing with in 2009 was. And they wound up dealing with a totally different problem. And interest rates were super low for all this time. People were spending money, cutting taxes. It was all fine. Now, though, that's not true, right? There's no popular way to address the fiscal problems in the United States. Just saying mortgage rates go through the roof, that's not popular. Raising taxes, not popular. Cutting Social Security, not popular. And that's bad that we have to make these ugly choices, but it does mean that there's potentially some room for the merits to gain purchase in the argument. And it's just it's still true that taxing pollution is a relatively good way to raise revenue if you need revenue.
If you're talking to a senator who needs $100 billion a year, just let me know.
I'm looking.
I think the liberalism thing is I take it to heart. Tyler Cowen's book, Stubborn Attachments, does a really nice job talking about, if the goal is a lot of people living relatively free, good lives, then you sort of keep, no matter how you try to explore the state space, you keep falling into you want a high growth world with relatively little pollution. And liberalism can help develop that world, I think. And whether that's more tactical or whether it's trying to figure out, how do we kind of keep progress going and prevent the populist tide? I do think those self-correcting mechanisms are important toward that long-term view, right? Lots of people, growing economies without too much pollution.
I guess I take a slightly different view of the relationship between liberalism and climate change, which goes back to the very first comment I made. My question is, how do we preserve liberalism in the face of climate change? Less that I think that liberalism is the answer to climate change, but that climate change, because it can provoke such extreme reactions, both from the left and the right, represents a really bad threat to the possibility of liberalism continuing to be something that people are willing to rely on. So I see it, now in order to avoid that trap, I think people with liberal commitments need to come up with better ways to get to the answers. And, we've been talking about some of the ways to get that, but I guess that's my kind of answer about the relationship between those things.
Who else out there?
Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Medja. I come from Jubilee Consortium in Los Angeles. The question builds off your final comment here and pertains to green consumer technology adaptation writ large. In my home country of Hungary, we have quickly become one of the mass producers of batteries for electric vehicles within the EU, mainly through Chinese and Korean factories, which in turn have become mass polluters in their areas, zero regulation, zero oversight, no interest whatsoever in the environmental health impacts of the communities writ large. So the question then is what to do about this catch-22, because as the professor was saying, it would be great if China mass-produced a bunch of batteries for electric vehicles that would then be brought to the United States. except it wouldn't be great for the Chinese people who are living in proximity to those factories. So the question I have in my mind is what to do in this case. What is the responsibility of these liberal democracies who want to achieve these environmentally friendly goals and so forth when they have to deal with illiberal entities to mass produce the technology that they want to implement? How to go about this catch-22, or is there something that I don't understand?
Do you want to start? When we learn to make stuff, in a cleaner, more efficient way, that's something that's exportable and transferable. And I would certainly argue that that's a role the United States historically has played and will continue to play. The story I told at the beginning about how environmental protection essentially began and the institutional frameworks in which it evolved are the background to all the environmental regulations we have. One can argue that those underlying institutional frameworks have been more important in the larger environmental trends in this country than the burst of environmental regulations we adopted in the 1970s. Right? Air pollution, water pollution, both declining before the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act were adopted. Those enactments in Washington, D.C. were symptomatic of broader trends occurring across institutions at all levels of government and outside of government, as our understanding and understanding of environmental problems and desire to deal with them was increasing dramatically in the 60s and 70s. How you deal with that in a country that doesn't have the same underlying liberal institutional framework, concern about property rights, concern about Party A fouling Party B's nest, is a serious challenge. And I don't have an easy answer for it because there's no magic wand to make any country have those sorts of institutional arrangements. There is ability, though, to let other parts of the world benefit from technological development here. And rather than just saying, okay, you go make it dirty, it's, well, if we know how to make it clean, but it can be made cheaper in our clean way somewhere else, allow that to be exported. And some of the work that Mike Vandenberg and some of us have been doing about the way supply chains help with that, I think point in that direction. And there are ways that government policy can streamline or kind of grease the skids for more of that to happen, so that it's not Chinese industrial techniques that are being used to build the batteries. It's U.S. techniques, even if it's ultimately done elsewhere and at lower cost.
I would also jump in. This is an area where trade policy can make a pretty big difference, right? So here in the States, we're talking a lot about border carbon measures associated with the emissions intensity of supply chains. Europe has a border adjustment, which is meant to control how carbon intensive imports can be. As a lot of these new energy technologies or commodities are growing into robust, mature markets, we can decide how the rules of those markets will play out. But
there's a question on that, though. But that'll address carbon, right? It won't necessarily address traditional forms of pollution that, in terms of local areas, are going to be more acute.
No, that's right. That's a carbon thing, or you might use human rights, or you can choose the thing, but it won't necessarily be like the water pollution or something.
I mean, the common law set of institutions that have at a baseline view about the need to protect property rights is a kind of an institutional benefit that we take for granted, and it makes it sometimes hard to export what we do here elsewhere beyond the technology, right? Because the institutional framework's different.
I mean, I would just say, I would add briefly, in the case of Hungary specifically, that's not a U.S. D.C. issue. That's a Brussels issue.
Yeah. Here, say. Pat. Yeah. Got a mic.
I got the last plane out of Houston before the Category 1 hurricane hit. Category 1 hurricane in Houston is very normal. You don't need climate change. We have them all the time, but every year the damage and the chaos and the confusion gets worse and worse. A Category 1 hurricane is still what it was when those categories were invented. But what has happened is in this, and I don't agree that either left or right extremes have anything to offer for the practical problems of climate change. Fundamentally, they are engineering problems. And my question for the panel is, can you think of anything, a proposal or let's say a role for the international classification societies in building nuclear power plants that completely replaces post-Reconstruction bond lawyers. Okay, can you think of anything that might be a liberal breakthrough in the center that would give us more hope of dealing intelligently with climate change, actually improving liberalism, grounding it in something other than legislation and court decisions and crap like that?
Any thoughts?
I don't have a great answer to that, but I will make one comment. I'm not sure this is going to answer your question, but one of the things that's unusual about the United States, even among liberal societies and liberal democracies, is that the people who run this country are generally speaking lawyers. And that's not true in most countries. In most countries, it's engineers who run the country.
Well, there's a local manifestation of it. In Houston, we say the civil engineering is done by bond lawyers.
Right. Right. I mean, I think one thing that is going to happen, and this is a market-based solution, is, we're all reading the headlines. The insurance companies are coming for people living on coastlines. They're living in fire zones. I just saw an announcement today that people who live in fire zones are going to see their insurance rates go up by 60% in California, and the rest of the state's also going up by 30%. This is going to create actually really interesting cross pressures, because the real question is, I live in central Los Angeles. We don't have a fire problem in central Los Angeles. I'm subsidizing the people living up in those canyons, and that's bullshit. And there's going to be political revolts over that. And at some point, people in upstate New York or in central Ohio are not going to be too keen on paying for, Marco Rubio's constituents in West Florida.
Are they going to point their finger at the right place? I mean, the reality is the way we regulate insurance is a massive contributor to that.
No doubt.
This goes, if for hurricane damage, this goes back to 20 some years, like in Florida at least. We subsidize insurance in disaster prone areas. We subsidize development in disaster prone areas, and then we don't like having to pay for the consequences. And I should note, right? Last time the Senate considered doing something about this, I think it was I'm going to get the exact number wrong. I remember blogging it at the time, but like all but one of the members of the Climate Caucus in the Senate voted against ending coastal subsidies, right? I mean, when it actually came to doing something tangible to reduce economic, and let's not say not just economic vulnerability, but human vulnerability, the constituents and donors who live on the coast were just in the fancy houses were just too important.
But also, I mean, not just donors, things like that, but to me, that's a great example of the need to liberalize. I mean, in the philosophical sense, right? The conversation around climate, right? The theme here is that there is a scientific facts about greenhouse gases, and there are geophysical facts about ocean levels and things that do that. And we want policymakers to think about those facts when they consider the many, many, many issues that arise in Congress related to flood insurance, related to taxation, related to permitting, which I think means getting out of the frame of this totalizing illiberal climate movement that wants a solution, right? It's a reality that has to be grappled with piecemeal rather than fixed.
So you said at the very beginning something that I thought was interesting. Is that it doesn't seem like there's actually this much debate around how to deal with this issue. You're a thoughtful person. What are the debates you want to see around climate change or climate change policy?
I mean, I just think that I think about there's a kind of a general space of the moderate middle-aged white guy who thinks Trump is bad, but is also worried that the left has gone too far. That's me. That's a lot of people up here. It's a lot of people on the panel before. It's a lot of Atlantic essays. And when those people do maybe the left has gone too far bit, you hear a lot about identity politics and race. You hear maybe stuff about gender and sexuality. I think you rarely see actually climate in that framework as something that is like personally annoying, middle-aged, moderate writers who live in Brooklyn or whatever. But it's such a consequential topic because energy touches on everything, because taxes touch on everything, because trade touches on everything, that when the facts are wrong, right? When the same like social pressure dynamics of quote unquote cancel culture stop people from saying like, hey, like that's not true. That like 6 years to end humanity thing. It's not true that your grandchildren are going to be worse off in absolute terms than you are today. Like it's really toxic.
Or like, I like driving a nice vehicle or an internal combustion vehicle, and I want to keep doing that.
Yeah. Or just like or like agriculture is important to emissions, and also like people just like meat. Right? You know, like we're not going to have net zero in 2040. I think everyone who's thought about this like knows that, but no one wants to say it, right? And like Joe Biden will say all the time, climate change is an existential threat to humanity. And like that's not true, and he's also not a particularly left-wing politician. Right. And it's weird to have a world in which moderate Democrats will pay lip service to these very extremist takes, but then his actual policymaking is not consistent with the idea of and it's like confusing to people. I think young activists are like, why aren't politicians taking this existential threat seriously? And like, they're not taking it seriously because it's not true. But if they don't say that that's the reason for what they're doing, right? It's discrediting to them. It's destabilizing. And so we wind up with like people throwing paint at art, right? Or like stopping traffic on a random bridge. And you're like, well, why are you doing that, right? But I see why they do it. If you read the newspaper, if you just took this rhetoric at face value, you'd say like, oh my God, the leaders of society, they're not just like failing to fully account for the external impacts of blah, 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 blah. They're like driving us off the cliff, and we've got to stop them. And so like people need to say things that are accurate, in my opinion. Okay, we got last one? Last thoughts? Yeah, please.
Picking up a little bit, sorry, John Trobach, Illiberalism Studies Program. Picking up a little bit on that last thought, I wanted to ask specifically if on the whole you feel that liberalism's kind of commitment to personal autonomy, freedom to act and everything is a positive thing or a negative thing in the context of global climate change. Joseph, to pick up on a point that you raised just before we opened to Q&A, electric vehicles are great, certainly better than the alternative, but there is another alternative, public transportation. So if that kind of commitment to my right to kind of act how I wish to, my freedom to act stops where the other person's nose starts, right? If that on the whole is as a kind of a fundamental philosophical part of liberalism, you see as net benefit or net negative to the fight against climate change?
I actually think it is a net benefit, but can be challenging in the near term. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, this is an engineering problem. Like, we don't really know what the right balance is between vehicle electrification, driving hybrids, encouraging more public transportation with funding. But like, we sort of need a search process that's going to allow us to evaluate which combination of those things is the right one. And personal choice plays a huge part in that, right? So like, authoritarian societies want to claim that they're really better at strategic long-term prioritization, because that means like a rough decade is okay, right? And like, we can
make an omelet without breaking eggs is the traditional phrase.
And like, hopefully we can like do a better job of that. And then you might find solutions that don't exist in the, like, this is a very model driven enterprise, that don't exist in the right model. Like, electric bikes are this like weird new technology that a lot of people love and are like the fastest selling electric vehicles in the country. And they weren't something that we were thinking about as a meaningful emissions reducing tool 5 years ago. But now, if you look at the deployment of e-bikes and e-scooters particularly in India and other emerging markets in South Asia, they're keeping like 1.5 million barrels of oil off the market every day. And so there are ways in which sort of consumer choice ends up can play a huge role in discovering things that we wouldn't have otherwise found.
I mean, the Soviet Union had great subways and terrible environmental outcomes.
I mean, I would say it's a benefit, but it's also a necessity. I mean, the reality is the goal is to have a low carbon civilization in which people are free and get to live lives that they think are worthwhile, right? And trying to direct and control how they live their lives in all those ways that affect energy is not really compatible with that. So on the one hand, we could easily, we could have the Soviet example in the extreme. I don't think that's what any of us wants, but it's also not likely to solve the climate problem. And what Joe just talked about with bikes and hybrids are the same thing. You go back to the debates we were having in the 1990s about ZEVs. No one was even thinking that there might be a hybrid option. And California is trying to, these timetables for electric vehicles back in the 90s, they kept having to shift, and they realized, oh, wait, they need heaters, and how do you have the heater because the batteries aren't powerful enough, and then suddenly someone comes along and starts selling hybrids that were not accounted for in any of the regs, right? So we can't plan our way to it. We can think about what sort of institutional arrangements will allow for decarbonization within a free and dynamic and growing economy. There are some parts of that that should be relatively easy, removing barriers to innovation and deployment, dealing with permitting. I would argue doing things like technology inducement prizes to deal with the fact that patents don't do a very good job of spurring investment and innovation in the environmental space because of unpriced externalities. There are parts of those institutional frameworks that are hard, pricing carbon. But we know generally that if we want to think about, if we look at the other sorts of environmental improvements we've had historically and what made them possible, it was the right set of institutional arrangements, not trying to plan what the proper balance is between the degree of autonomy you should have and the energy consumption or emissions that produces. And we've got to rediscover that and work through it.
All right, I'm going to prove that liberalism can work and solve problems by ending the panel on time. So thanks, everybody. It's a fantastic discussion. Thanks for coming.